Okay, this brings us to question number 3, which is perhaps one of my favorite questions for the year. And there's a lot of information there. You've paused the video or have read it over on the worksheet enough. Here are the details on how to solve this question. So question A is referring to the birds collected, the percentage of birds collected that had bands on them the second time that they actually collected the birds. So from the subsequent samples, is there a difference in the proportions? So we're going to analyze the percentage here compared with the percentage here. So it begins with the first step, which is to state the hypothesis. So in the very beginning, it's going to be, are the percentages the same, or are the percentages different from the two islands? The second step would be to check those conditions, name the test, and state the significance level. It's not a simple random sample of birds. They're just birds that are collected as best they can collect them. So the sample is not random enough. More on the issues with this research in just a couple minutes. Do we have enough people in the sample, or do we have enough birds in the sample? To figure that out, we need to actually calculate the weighted percent, which would be the total number of birds with bands from Island A that were collected, plus the total number of birds from Island B with bands on them, divided by the total number of birds that were collected the second time, plus all the birds collected in Island B the second time. Okay, this work gets you about 12%, and it's that number that you're going to need to multiply to the grand total number of birds, which was 400 that were collected. So the number that should have bands would be about 12% of 400, which is greater than or equal to 10. And the ones that shouldn't have bands would be the remaining ones, which is definitely greater than or equal to 10. So the sample is not random enough, but it's big enough. The significance level we could set at 1%, and we can and should state it that it's a 2-proportion z-test. And since we named the test in step number 2, in step number 3 we can do that entire step using the graphing calculator menus. So finding the 2-proportion z-test, you find out that the z-score is about negative 2.9. And since it's a 2-sided test, we also have to shade on the symmetric side, on the positive side of it, the same amount of probability. So the z-score comes out to be negative 2.9. That's important. But maybe more important than that would be our p-value, which would be about 4%, or 0.4%. So on to the fourth step. The p-value is definitely low. You're going to reject the ho in favor of the ha. So it appears that the percentage of birds that are banded are different the second time around. All right, question B is showing that the banding can help them estimate how many total birds that are on a particular island. Looking at Island A, 12 out of the 180 birds that were collected had bands. That was around 7%. And if 7% of the number of birds had bands, then if we multiply that percent to the grand total number of birds, we should get 200, which was the original amount that actually had the bands on them. So 12% of the birds, or 12 out of 180, had bands on them. So it's around 7% of the population. 7% of some number is probably close to 200, because 200 had the bands on originally. And if you solve that question by multiplying both sides by 180 over 12, you end up estimating that the total number of birds on Island A was somewhere around 3,000. Now on to the last question. I mean, the results from A and B are very, very nice and can give us an estimate of how many birds there are, but there are many issues about this procedure, especially since we're working with birds. So this is where Island B comes into play. I mean, these birds are birds. I mean, they can fly, I would assume, if they're flying birds, or even swim away if they're penguins. So these birds will be mixing between one island to the next. These birds could also be flying off of the island and onto the mainland. So there's one concern right there. Or there might be new birds coming in from another island that's not even being examined, or from a different landmass. So there's some issues with this procedure for its accuracy. There's other issues too. I mean, a bird that is banded may be more easily be caught or slowed down, or more easily seen by predators, or maybe be an old bird that's on its way out anyway. So if that's the case, where that does happen, we actually have a situation where the birds could die out and not return to the population. Or on the happy side of things, a bird could also be born during that time. Said the researchers left the island for some time and then they returned. So there is a chance that the birds could be, new birds could be born, and of course they wouldn't be born with bands on their legs. There are some other possible issues here too, beyond those ones, but those are some good ones to think about in terms of the reality of this question.